Mr. Jonathan Bunce was a fellow of one of the more distinguished colleges of Cambridge University. Now, the precise period of his brief tenure is immaterial to this story, and for reasons which I think will become obvious, I shan't particularise his college further than by calling it All Hallows. If any of you really do desire to know more, then I can only recommend that you apply your knowledge of the various college courts of Cambridge to the passing details of the true story that follows and draw your own conclusions. If you carry your curiosity still further and ask for the textual authorities of my tale, then I'll be more frank. They are two, and two only. The first is a written diary, which Mr. Bunce kept assiduously until his death. Now, parts of it, I'm told, were published by the Mathematical Society in 1879, and the original manuscript, which I have been allowed to consult, is still in the possession of Mr. Bunce's great nephew. He's a clergyman in Shropshire, a very nice man. The other text is to be found in a printed volume, which can easily be consulted by anyone who has access to the university library. Simply inquire in room theta. But first, the diary. Now, Mr. Bunce lived in Cambridge at a time when the main duty of the college don was to amble up and down the backs on a safe nag in pursuit of an appetite for the evening's port wine. But you see, it's clear from his diary entries that Mr. Bunce took a much more serious view of his studies. These studies were devoted to the purest of pure mathematics. And I gather from the profound and rather long-winded entries in the diary that Mr. Bunce was engaged at the time of his death upon a magnum opus, a mighty work of astronomy and geometry, which was to shake the stars in their complacent courses and leave the moon dumbfounded. Now, I'm not myself at all an expert in things mathematical, but I'm given to understand that more than one of Mr. Bunce's assertions or conclusions or discoveries, I'm afraid I don't know the correct term, but more than one has been developed and amplified by a distinguished mathematician working in this university today. To the lay mind, however, much of his diary is opaque and of little interest, and it's not until the last month of his life that poor Mr. Bunce seems to have become a human being. Then, at last, you see, he starts to complain of solitude and to blame himself for having lost touch with his fellow man. I mean, perhaps he was disillusioned, perhaps he was simply overworked, but the entry "bad dreams" appears again and again. Now, at first, Mr. Bunce does not describe these dreams in any detail, and then one morning he becomes arrestingly frank. "All night long," he writes, "I kept seeing that wicked old fellow Geshovius in my sleep. He kept prowling up and down the cloisters, hitting at the flags with his stick, and a huge black dog came prowling behind him." Now, not long after that, there comes another very odd entry. "I must fight these dreams," he writes. The word "fight" is underlined. "I dreamed last night that a tall brown man, like a pharaoh, was standing by my bed, naked except for a loincloth, and with a white hood on his head, like the pictures of Egyptians in books. He put his hand on my brow, and somehow I felt that I must rise and go into my living room to put out the candle which he insisted I had left alight. The worst of it was that when I did wake up, I still felt that I must go and see if the candle were lit. It wasn't, of course." Well, a week later, and Bunce seems to have become seriously alarmed about the state of his health. "I find myself doing it again," he notes, "climbing into the new court from my window and shouting those hideous words from under that picture that shows Geshovius in the colonnade. I can't keep them out of my mind, waking or sleeping." The very last entry in the diary runs as follows: "I know I must do it. I can't hold out another night. I know that he lives in that tree. I shall climb it and find him when he next calls, and then, well, something for good or evil must happen. Well, so much for the diary. The printed book is actually a far more interesting compilation, and in its own way, every whit as learned as Bunce's own writing. In fact, I cordially recommend it to all students of old Teutonic and indeed classical mythology. Bunce notes its title, De Signis Mysticis, in his diary, and I had little difficulty in running it to earth. The full title is, in fact, De Coniuratione Daemonum Mortuum aut Aeternum per Signa Quatuor Mystica. It is the work of one Dr. Jacobus Geshovius of the University of Wittenberg, and the date of publication is 1571. Now, at first sight, this book looks to be nothing more than a rather dull Latin treatise upon the elements of Euclid. I mean, it's profusely garnished with circles and crescents and rhomboids, oddly lettered triangles, strange pentagrams and the like. But a more careful inspection produces a very different impression. To begin with, it has some very striking illustrations. Facing the title page is a portrait of the learned Dr. Geshovius himself. He's a fat, puffy old gentleman with a bushy white beard and dull, sleepy eyes, and not, you would say at first glance, a particularly memorable personage. But when you turn to the other illustrations, which are scattered up and down the book, you will, I think, change your mind, as I did mine. Because in every one of them, the portly figure of Dr. Geshovius reappears, and they seem to picture some very strange incidents from his earthly career. In one, we see the doctor sitting peacefully at his studies, like St. Jerome in his cell. He's surrounded by stuffed monkeys and dead lizards, and through a crack in the shuttered window, a thin shaft of moonlight falls on his bald pate, as though a cold, watchful eye from without were staring in upon him. In another picture, he's shown on a midnight ramble through a desolate valley, following a clumsy black poodle up the mountainside. In a third, Dr. Geshovius apparently finds himself in a ruined crypt, and before him, standing shadowless within a circle chalked upon the ground, is a nun. Pale, rather beautiful woman with parted lips and eyes fixed as though in a trance. Another picture gives us an orchard under a full moon. In the centre of this is a tall tree, and against its trunk there leans a rickety ladder. Now, at first glance, you don't notice the inevitable Dr. Geshovius. But then there he is, among the leaves in the tree, climbing up and stretching out his hand to touch. Well, in fact, yeah, what is it that he's trying to touch? Just above his head is what looks like a dark, naked leg hanging down, as though someone above were sitting astride a bough, and stretching down through the leaves towards the toiling doctor is a long, thin hand. It's a very strange picture and rather eerie. But perhaps in some ways, but perhaps because of the reference of it in Bunce's diary, the most remarkable picture in the book is one that stands halfway through. Dr. Geshovius's travels, you see, seem to have brought him to Venice, and he's shown wandering up and down the colonnade of some palazzo. An unseen moon floods the court with light, and as he paces under the arches, we see that Geshovius is beating upon the flags at his feet with a stout oaken cudgel, and strangely sinister he looks as he does it. And under this image are written the words, Veni, veni, precor, topet amenhotas. Come, come, I prithee, topet amenhotas. Now, I must tell you that the written contents of this volume are quite as fascinating as those woodcuts. I mean, that's true. There's a good deal of jargon about the conjunction of the macrocosmos with the microcosmos, or the marriage of the red lion and the lily, which to me remains but jargon. But beyond this medieval mummery, Dr. Geshovius shows himself deeply read in the legendary lore of many different climes and different ages. Now, many of his tales that he tells are entirely new to me, and even for those that are familiar, he generally offers a highly original interpretation of his own. At the risk of boring you, I'd like to relate two of the tales in some detail, partly because they're typical of Geshovius's approach, I think, and also because they seem to have some bearing upon the experiences of our Mr. Bunce. So, about halfway through the book, we find a heading, De Narciso et Econe Nympha. This is the Geshovian variant of the old tale of the beautiful youth Narcissus. The nymph, Echo, pining away for unrequited love, ere she dies, calls upon the great Pan, or Mephistopheles, adds the doctor, to avenge her upon the beautiful youth who has spurned her, Narcissus. Pan hears Echo's cry and promises that after death she shall lure her heedless lover to his doom. In the meantime, Narcissus is hunting the Caledonian boar with his friend Meleager. He outstrips all of his companions in his ardour for the chase, and from sunrise to sundown and after, he follows hard upon the tracks of the boar, always faintly seen galloping just ahead of him. Then suddenly, in a wild and desolate valley, skirted on one side by a dark forest, the boar disappears from view, and Narcissus finds himself alone, gaping up at the full moon in an empty sky. As he stands there gaping, Dr. Geshovius explains, a violent and uncontrollable longing overcomes him to shout and howl at the moon, to bay like one of his own dogs, and accordingly he shouts his own name to the moon, Narcissus, 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 for several minutes on end. Now, at last, the fit dies away, and he stops shouting as suddenly as he'd begun. But far away, in the depths of the wood, he hears the voice of the dead nymph Echo, crying imploringly back, Narcissus, Narcissus, Narcissus. Well, his one thought now is to escape from what Geshovius rather brilliantly calls the moonstruck shouting dingle. And so he dashes into the wood in search of the unseen Echo, crying out alternately, Narcissus, Narcissus, and Echo, I, Echo, as he goes. The distant voice takes up his cry and lures him deeper and deeper into the wood until at last he finds himself by a lonely pool under high overarching trees. Now, wearied out with his long night wandering, Narcissus flings himself down beside the pool and stoops to drink from its waters. But as he does so, he hears the reeds whisper his name, and reflected in the surface of the pool, he sees not his own image, but that of a dark brown face with a goat's beard and horns upon its forehead. And as he looks, two skinny arms rise, Excalibur-like from the mere, and draw him down beneath the surface. And so, like Hylas, Narcissus perishes in a woodland lake. But, and Dr. Geshovius is very clear about this, he says it was not the nymph Echo that drew him down. And he adds some wise and profound remarks upon the folly of dallying with an echo when the moon is at the full. It may not be your own voice which replies to you, he says. Now, the other tale that I'd like to read you follows almost immediately after, and is, if anything, stranger still. The chapter is headed De Fabricio Filioque Suo Vati. Now, a hasty reader might translate this as of the smith and his son the poet, but a close study of the stories that Dr. Geshovius has to tell proves that we are dealing with rather more curious folk than the village blacksmith and his solitary offspring. For it is the doctor's contention that, and I'm quoting him here, the great god Pan takes many forms in many countries according to the name and spell whereby he is conjured up. In Egypt, they call him Amenhotep, says Geshovius. But in Germany, He's the blacksmith, or Squire Volant, or is known through the name of his son, Vata. Now, Squire Volant is none other than Wayland the Smith, you see, the master blacksmith of German and Norse mythology. And Vata is his son Wade, or Wada, the theme of so many songs in olden days. Now, Dr. Geshovius has gathered together many tales about this father and son, and one of them, the last, I will now relate to you in full. In the village of Birkdees, writes Dr. Geshovius, there once lived a cowherd whose duty it was to tend his master's herds all through the summer in a large field high above the village. Now, one summer, this cowherd noticed that at the time of the full moon, every morning, there came down from the mountain 12 oxen of more than usual size and beauty, which grazed the whole day long with his master's herds. In the evening, it was the cowherd's wont to stand upon a rock above his field and with shouts loud and long to call the cattle into the pound by his hut. But this particular season, he noted that every time he ceased from his shouting, a voice repeated his cry in the self-same tones from the mountain above him, whereat the 12 strange oxen would leave the other herd and climb up the mountainside out of his view. Well, for some time, the cowherd thought little of this matter, but one day he was taken with a desire to steal these fine oxen for his master. So he drove them into the pound before the setting of the sun and tethered them down so that they could not move, and then he stood upon the rock and called in the other cattle as before. When he had done crying, he heard the other voice shouting from the mountain, whereat the 12 oxen bellowed aloud as in distress and sought vainly to break their bonds. The cowherd, in derision, cried up the hill to the other, "Stulte, stultissime pastor!" Fool, most foolish shepherd. But he was much surprised to hear his own voice reply with great volume and in great wrath, "Stultissime pastor!" That night, he was unable to sleep for fear that the other cowherd should descend and in vengeance rob his master's herd. So he arose and went and sat on the side of the valley over against the cattle pound. And as he sat there, he became aware, says Geshovius, of a form of more than human stature advancing on him in wrath down the opposite side of the valley. And he noticed that at the same time, the 12 oxen in the pound began lowing as though with pleasure. The other cattle now woke with a loud scream and rushed madly from the pound in 2 separate flocks to opposite ends of the valley, as though, Geshovius tells us, one of the old gods had passed through their midst. Well, the cowherd was now so frightened that he turned tail and ran back into the village. His master's herds were never seen again, although men say that they can be heard mooing in the mountains, where they are tended by the wicked demon, Wada. Now, how, you may ask, did this strange volume find its way into the hands of the mathematically minded Mr. Bunce? Well, in fact, his diary explains that. He'd gone to the university library one day in search of Ramsden's tractate on rhomboids and found to his disgust that fine volume had been taken out. In the vain hope that it might have slipped down the back of the bookcase, he'd thrust his hand through the gap in the row of books and had pulled forth De Coniuratione Daimonem by Jacobus Geshovius of Wittenberg, and very, very dusty and mouldy it was too. But like mine, his attention was captured by those curious woodcuts, and Bunce had taken the book back to his rooms to study at his greater leisure. Now, his rooms were on the south side of the cloister court of his college, overlooking, as he tells us, the new court, in the centre of which still grows a solitary tree. Often of a night, between bouts of brainwork, Mr. Bunce would stand at his window, gazing meditatively at this tree, or else he would perhaps pace the cloisters for half an hour, deep in some mathematical rumination. Now, as you may well know, the cloisters of All Hallows College have one very remarkable peculiarity. As you walk down the north side, you become aware of the deep, dull echo of your own footsteps following you behind, growing ever louder as you draw nearer to the western end of the vault. I mean, college porters, in fact, still point out to tourists one particular flagstone in which all the echo seems to be concentrated to its loudest volume. In fact, if you strike upon this with your stick or stand upon it and shout, the sound will be taken up with startling clarity at the far end of the cloister. Well, late one night, Mr. Bunce was pacing up and down the north side of the cloister, lost in thought and wholly deaf to the echo of his own footsteps. The moon was at its zenith, and he stopped for a moment to gaze upon it. And as he did so, a vague memory of Dr. Geshovius striking at the floor with his stick floated into his mind. Now, he was standing at that moment on the mysterious echoey flagstone, and without knowing why, he suddenly muttered to himself the curious words in the book, "Veni, veni, precor, topet amen hotas," and stamped his foot 3 times. Scarcely had he done so than he stood transfixed with terror. For the echo gave back not the sound of his own feet stamping, but a patter of naked feet, which ran swiftly on the stones of the cloister walk until it seemed that they came to rest just behind him. He veered round with a start and saw nothing but the empty moonlit cloister. For a moment he simply stood there blinking. What was he, dreaming? He looked up again at the placid moon, and he knew not why, but he felt that he was enmeshed in some horrible dream world. God, if only he could shout and wake himself from the nightmare. 3 times his voice refused to pass through his parched throat, and then suddenly he found himself howling and bellowing his own name to the moon like a frightened dog. "Bunce! Bunce! Bunce!" The echo took up his cry and seemed to roll back upon him in sardonic mockery from the shadowy walls of the cloister, and yet still he could not wake himself. At length he stopped, half in shame, and listened to the echo slowly dying away. Fainter and fainter it grew, and then to his straining ear there came a thin, clear cry down the cloister. "Venio, Domine! Venio! I come, master, I come." Well, Mr. Bunce owns that he fled like the foolish cowherd and did not recover his peace of mind until he was in his own rooms with his papers on the table in front of him. Well, he would, of course, have liked to have forgotten his mad behaviour in the cloisters, but fate was against him. All the next day he felt vaguely aware of an unseen presence in his rooms. He seemed to mock and sneer at his astronomical calculations, and in the evening this feeling became insupportable. He rose angrily from his table and went to the large blackboard that stood by his window, and in a half-hearted way he began chalking up some old proposition from Euclid upon it. His mind was still running on Dr. Geshovius and his book, and he scarcely noticed what his hand was doing. Tonight, he couldn't banish from his thoughts the picture of the pale-faced nun in the ruined crypt. On the page facing that picture was the diagram of a circle with a large pentagram in its midst, and underneath this diagram was a short admonition to the effect that the necromancer must be advised not to break the circle, else, in the words of Dr. Geshovius, the spook will escape into the common air and there will be a fine scrimmage. From this picture, with its diagram, Bunce's mind ran onto his panic in the cloister the night before, and ere he could stop to think, he found himself again muttering, "Veni, veni, precor, topet amen hotas." The moment that these words were past his lips, he woke from his reverie with a start, and gazed upon the blackboard. He'd been tracing the circle and the pentagram of the pale-faced nun. Well, with an angry oath, he picked up the duster to rub it out, and making one clean sweep across it, he broke the chalk line of the circle's circumference. And as soon as he did this, the glass of his lamp shattered, and the moon was plunged into darkness. His foot seemed to catch in the stand of the blackboard, and it fell upon him, and in the crash and the darkness, he could have sworn that he heard 2 naked feet drop gently from the blackboard to the floor. Well, Mr. Bunce was unutterably frightened. He scrambled to his feet and groped his way towards the fire to light a taper. As he stooped to thrust it into the flames, he glanced over his shoulder at the window by which the blackboard had been standing. Now, before this hung 2 thin muslin curtains through which the moonlight poured into a ghostly patch on the floor, and behind them, in the embrasure, between him and the world outside, Mr. Bunce could make out a vague, shadowy form, a tall man, naked, but for some strange covering on his head, and leaning forward into the room with his hands at his sides, as though waiting orders. Now, this vision somehow infuriated Mr. Bunce. He strode toward the windows, pulled the curtains apart, and found himself staring, as of old, at the solitary tree in the courtyard below. Again, the old feeling of nightmare flooded his being, and in another moment he'd pushed open the windows and was leaning on the sill, shouting his own name at the moon. And as the last reverberation of his cries rolled away, he heard a thin, sneering voice from over the battlements on the opposite side of the court. "Veni, Domine! Veni!" It was after this that the period of bad dreams referred to in the diary began. At first, his sleep was tortured with visions of Dr. Geshovius. Dr. Geshovius and the beautiful nun. Dr. Geshovius and the black poodle. Dr. Geshovius prowling round the cloisters below his rooms, striking at the echoing flagstones with his stick. But gradually, the phantom changed. It was no longer the stolid German doctor that he beheld at night. It was the vague, dark figure of an Egyptian, lurking unseen in the far corners of his bedroom, who, as soon as Bunce closed his eyes, tiptoed across the room and stood beside his bed, staring down at him. Now, as the figure stood there, it would stretch out a hand and touch Bunce's forehead, and with the touch of its cold forefinger, all strength and will faded from him. He would awake, struggling wildly to find his room silent and empty, with a frantic desire to get up and do something that the spectre had put into his brain. Now, so for several nights he felt that he must go down into the cloister and stamp upon the echoing flagstone. He struggled and fought against this longing, cramming the bedclothes into his mouth to stifle his screams, for he knew that if once he yielded, then he was a lost soul. And then, at the close of a week, he began to feel that he had triumphed over fate. Now, the Egyptian still came to his bed as he slept. He still touched him with his cold hand, but the old insidious suggestion had altered. Bunce now woke each night possessed with a desire to do some trivial action, and with each night the action became more and more trivial. One night he felt himself compelled to wander down to the porter's lodge and touch a long blue mantle that he'd seen hanging there the day before, and yet when he arrived there, the mantle was gone, and he crawled back to bed in some shame. Another night, as we've heard, he rose to put out a candle in his living room, a candle which was not alight. A third night, he found himself stumbling around his room in search of a scrap of scribbled paper, which he finally remembered he'd thrown in the fire before going to bed. And then for 3 nights, he had a blessed respite from all dreams and all temptations. These were the 3 nights of the new moon, and he vaguely ascribed his relief to that event. And so, for that brief time, he thought that he'd overcome. His dreams had grown quieter and fainter, the phantom at his bedside more dim and shadowy, the temptations less compelling. This hope, however, died almost at its birth. On the 4th night, the shadowy Egyptian was back at his bedside, forcing him to rise and turn the key in his bedroom door, only to find that the key was not there. And he noted with despair that as the moon drew near to its zenith, his dreams grew sharper and more definite, and his tormentor stood out with a greater, colder intensity from the surrounding gloom. Gradually, the temptations grew less and less trivial, until at last only one suggestion filtered through his brain, and it was no longer to strike the flagstone in the cloister. Now it was to lower himself from the window into the court below, climb the solitary tree, and touch its topmost branch with his hand. Twice he awoke to find himself crawling through the window and gripping at the ivy to lower himself down into the court, and twice he forced himself back to bed in the depths of shame. On the night before the moon would stand at its fullest, he knew that some kind of crisis was drawing near, and he sensed once more the horrid shouting sickness would overtake him. He must escape from the cloister, he decided, escape from that tree. And as the sun went down, he hurried through the college gate and struck out into the country. On and on he wandered, scarcely noticing whither he went. And when he slowly came to his senses, he found that he was leaning on a gate, gazing across a moonlit field in which a flock of sheep was sleeping. Behind him was a small wood, and far away he heard the chimes of Great St. Mary's, booming out an hour that told him that the day was near. The tranquil scene before him, the distant chimes with their news of daybreak behind him, filled him with a sense of hope and comfort. The night was fast spent, and nothing had happened. The shameful sickness had not come upon him. But as these thoughts flashed through his mind, he lifted his eyes and stared abstractedly at the sinking moon. At the first sound of his wild, inhuman barking, there was a noise like thunder behind him, as thousands on thousands of starlings soared out of the wood and flew screaming over his head with terrified cries. And with a ghastly sob, Bunce ceased his outcry and watched the birds. And as he watched, he heard them break out into a wild, confused babel, and suddenly the flock was split like magic into 2 companies, which scattered to opposite poles of the sky and faded out of sight. And then, in the field before him, he heard the sheep wake with a long-drawn bleat of terror, and they too broke into 2 separate flocks, which scampered to opposite ends of the meadow, as though some great presence were passing through their midst. And very faintly there came a cry, as of a shepherd saluting the dawn. Veni, O Domine! Veni, O! Then, far off along the eastern horizon, Mr. Bunce saw the first silent workings of the day, and he knew that he was saved. Yet he understood that it was only a respite. The fatal night of the moon's zenith still lay ahead of him, and now he felt himself so weakened in mind and will that he gave up hope and lost all desire to struggle against his tormentor. All that day, that last day, he cowered over his fire, brooding over the fate that surely lay in ambush for him. Now, a modern physician would doubtless have diagnosed Mr. Bunce's case as one of neurosis, following upon overwork. And a doctor with some knowledge of Vesalius and the obscure maladies that afflict the inhabitants of the Carpathian Mountains would have seen that this neurosis had taken the unfortunate form of lycanthropy. But you see, Mr. Bunce lived in times in which neurosis as a disease was not recognised, at any rate by name. And as for lycanthropy, well, the Cambridge of his day would have laughed it out of court. I mean, in its kinder moments, it might have ascribed poor Mr. Bunce's moonstruck ululations to youth or high spirits, or perhaps to a scholar's eccentricity. But for the most part, it would have wagged a sorrowful head over one more lapse from learning and propriety through an all too common weakness. And he, poor man, hugging his secret to his heart and vainly pondering over it, he could trace it to one source, and one source only: to the malign fate that had put the volume of Dr. Geshovius in his hands. Somehow, with the help of that accursed book, he had given himself over to the power of some evil spirit who he carelessly, unconsciously, inadvertently had conjured up from the deep and dead past, a spirit that in all ages and in all worlds never had been living and never would be dead, a spirit whose sole aim is in persecuting poor human nature with a grim and purposeless malevolence older than the earth itself. And why, he asked himself, had this hateful punishment been visited upon him? Why him? For what crime? Dully his eyes fell upon the papers on his table, with their wasted astronomical speculations. He thought of Dr. Geshovius sitting in his study in his thin shaft of moonlight, of Narcissus howling at the moon, of the moon itself riding calmly through the sky outside, cold and always vigilant. Was this hidden phantom that had pounced upon him the echo of his own voice? Or was it some revengeful minion of the moon, sent to chastise him for his denial of her influence, his blasphemous attempt to wrest her with his puny calculations from her time-honoured orbit? His tired brain could neither answer nor gainsay the suggestion. And so, in utter despair, he opened his journal and made that last final entry. I'm going to read it to you again. I know that I must do it, he says. I can't hold out another night. I know he lives in that tree. I shall climb it and find him when he next calls. And then, well, something for good or evil must happen. The struggle was over. His fate lay in other and stronger hands than his own. And who knows? Perhaps by bowing his head and yielding to his persecutor, he might, like Jacob of old, look on him face to face and wrestle with him, and so either mend or end his troubles. Well, no one can say precisely what passed on that last night. But around daybreak, an undergraduate sleeping in rooms on the farther side of the new court was woken by the sound of a dog baying at the moon. Drowsily, he remembered that more than once recently he'd seen a large black poodle prowling around the tree in the evenings, and without further thought, he turned over on his side and went back to sleep. The next morning, Mr. Bunce was found lying at the foot of the tree. His neck was broken, and the vital spark was extinguished.